Hello, ARMY. Imagine this for a second. The lights are low, the music fades into a soft heartbeat, and the camera slowly zooms in. Not on choreography, not on abs, not even on legendary vocals, but on something people swear they don't notice until they absolutely do. The nose. Strange? Maybe. Trivial? Not even close. In the world of visual harmony, facial balance, and that unexplainable "why can't I stop staring" effect, the nose quietly becomes the anchor of charisma. And when we talk about BTS, a group where every millimeter of detail feels intentional, the conversation suddenly turns fascinating. Because this isn't about plastic perfection or textbook beauty standards. This is about natural structure, facial harmony, cultural aesthetics, camera angles, genetics, growth, and the way time itself reshapes how we see beauty. Why does one member's nose look sharper under stage lights but softer in documentaries? Why does another member's profile suddenly go viral after a single airport photo? Why do fans argue endlessly about something so small, yet so powerful? And here's the real question that keeps people watching till the end. Does the neatest nose mean the smallest, the straightest, the most symmetrical, or the one that somehow tells the best story? Because noses don't just sit on faces. They age, they mature, they carry emotions, scars, smiles, exhaustion, and confidence. In Korean visual culture, a neat nose often symbolizes balance, elegance, and quiet strength, but BTS constantly breaks those molds in their own way. Some members have noses that feel artistic, others feel warm, others feel commanding, and some feel so real it hurts. This ranking is not about superiority. It's about perception, evolution, and the subtle power of facial identity. And yes, the order might surprise you. Some placements will feel obvious, others will feel controversial, and a few might make you rethink everything you thought you knew about visuals. So before we dive in, ask yourself this. When BTS stands still, no dancing, no singing, no filters, whose nose do you remember most and why? Keep that thought, because starting from number 7, every step closer to number 1 will quietly challenge it. Number 7, the classic line that grows on you. Jin's nose is the kind of feature that doesn't scream for attention, and that's exactly why it sits at number 7. Not because it lacks beauty, but because it plays a long game. At first glance, Jin's visuals overwhelm you with symmetry. The shoulders, the lips, the eyes, the proportions that made the term worldwide handsome stick like a permanent headline. His nose doesn't jump out immediately, and that's the trick. It's straight, clean, naturally proportioned, and incredibly stable from every angle, but it works quietly, like a supporting actor who ends up stealing your heart by the final scene. Jin's nose has a classical structure, neither too sharp nor too rounded, giving his face a timeless, almost actor-like quality that fits historical dramas just as effortlessly as modern runway shots. What makes it land at this rank is how subtle it is. Under harsh stage lighting, it blends smoothly into his facial harmony instead of cutting through it. Over the years, fans have noticed how Jin's nose becomes more expressive with age, not changing shape dramatically, but gaining character as his expressions deepen, especially when he smiles wide or laughs with his whole face. In behind-the-scenes footage and documentaries, his nose softens his visuals, making him feel approachable rather than intimidating, which perfectly matches his personality. Playful, emotionally intelligent, and quietly reassuring. In Korean beauty standards, a neat nose often leans toward sharp definition and standout profile impact, and Jin's leans more toward balance and warmth, which is why it doesn't dominate rankings like others, but don't mistake that for weakness. His nose anchors his face in realism, making his handsomeness feel human, not sculpted. And here's the interesting part. When Jin is serious, especially during interviews or live performances with minimal expression, the clean line of his nose suddenly becomes noticeable, almost regal, like it's reminding you that visuals don't need to shout to be powerful. That duality, soft when he's playful, firm when he's focused, is why fans slowly fall for it rather than instantly obsess over it. Number 7 isn't a downgrade. It's the foundation. Jin's nose sets the baseline for what neat truly means in BTS. Natural, consistent, and emotionally adaptable. And once you notice it, you can't unsee how it quietly completes his face without ever asking for applause. Number 6. Jungkook. Youthful sharpness that hits late. Jungkook's nose is one of those features that plays hide-and-seek with your attention, and that's exactly why it lands at number 6. For years, people talked about his eyes, his smile, his bunny teeth, his muscle lines, his stage presence. But his nose? It stayed quietly in the background, growing with him, maturing with him, waiting for the right moment to fully step into the frame. And when that moment came, especially in his mid-20s, it hit fans almost emotionally. Jungkook's nose carries a youthful sharpness that doesn't feel aggressive or overly defined, but clean, balanced, and surprisingly elegant. The bridge is straight without looking rigid. The tip is naturally rounded without drooping, and from the side profile, there's a softness that prevents it from feeling sculpted or artificial. What makes his nose fascinating is how it changes depending on context. On stage under intense lighting, it looks sharper and more commanding, but in casual live streams or behind-the-scenes footage, it softens instantly, giving him that boy-next-door warmth fans are deeply attached to. This dual nature is rare, a nose that can belong to a global pop star one second and to a quiet guy sipping iced coffee the next. Culturally, Jungkook's nose fits the modern Korean aesthetic of clean but approachable, which is why it doesn't dominate visuals the way more dramatic features do, but instead enhances everything else. Over time, as his face matured and his jawline became more defined, the neatness of his nose became more noticeable, not because it changed, but because his overall facial balance evolved. Fans who revisit early debut photos often realize this too late. His nose was always neat, just overshadowed by youth. Emotionally, Jungkook's nose plays a subtle role in how fans read his expressions. When he's shy, it scrunches slightly, adding innocence, and when he's serious, it straightens out, giving him quiet intensity without losing warmth. That's why his visuals feel honest rather than intimidating. He doesn't look untouchable, he looks real. In a group filled with strong visual signatures, Jungkook's nose doesn't demand attention. It earns it slowly, through consistency, natural growth, and emotional context. That's why number 6 feels right. It's not about peak sharpness or dramatic lines, but about how a neat nose quietly supports a face that millions feel emotionally connected to. And once you start noticing it, especially in side-profile airport photos or close-up performance cams, you realize this. Jungkook's nose may not be the loudest in the room, but it's one of the most emotionally readable, and that makes it unforgettable in its own quiet way. Number 5. Taehyung. The artistic curve that breaks the mold. Taehyung's nose sits at number 5 not because it's the neatest by textbook standards, but because it's the most artistic, and that distinction matters. His nose doesn't follow the typical idol blueprint of ultra-straight, ultra-slim, ultra-safe. Instead, it carries a subtle curve, a gentle prominence, a structure that immediately gives his face depth and narrative. From the side profile, Taehyung's nose feels cinematic. It's the kind of nose directors love because it casts shadows, creates mood, and adds texture to every frame. In still photos, especially black and white or low saturation shoots, his nose becomes a storytelling tool rather than just a feature. That's why so many of his photos feel like movie posters instead of idol promos. What makes it neat, despite its uniqueness, is control. The bridge is clean, the tip is defined without being sharp, and the overall line feels intentional rather than accidental. It fits his face like a signature, not a decoration. Emotionally, Taehyung's nose amplifies his expressions more than most. When he looks distant, it sharpens the melancholy. When he smiles softly, it adds warmth and nostalgia. When he stares intensely, it gives authority without aggression. This is why fans often describe his visuals as artsy or European, even though that's more about vibe than geography. In Korean visual culture, his nose is often labeled unconventional, but that's exactly what elevates it. It doesn't blend in, yet it remains balanced. Over the years, as Taehyung leaned deeper into acting, jazz aesthetics, and vintage fashion, his nose began to feel even more intentional, like it was always meant for this version of him. It supports his identity as someone who exists slightly outside the idol mold, someone who feels timeless rather than trendy. Number 5 represents controlled deviation, a neat nose that refuses to be boring, that adds character instead of chasing symmetry, and that makes you pause longer than expected when the camera lingers. Taehyung's nose doesn't ask to be ranked, it challenges the ranking itself. And that quiet rebellion is exactly why it holds the spot so confidently. Number 4, RM, the intellectual sharpness you can feel. RM's nose claims number 4 because it carries something rare, authority without arrogance. Structurally, his nose is clean, straight, and confidently prominent, but what truly makes it stand out is how perfectly it matches his intellectual aura. From the front, it anchors his face with maturity. From the side, it delivers a strong, composed profile that feels less like an idol and more like a thinker, a leader, someone who has lived inside ideas. RM's nose is neat in the most grown-up sense of the word. It doesn't aim for softness or cuteness, it aims for presence. And presence is exactly what it delivers. Under studio lighting or interview setups, his nose becomes a visual axis, balancing his deep-set eyes and expressive mouth, giving his face a sense of structure that feels intentional and steady. Emotionally, it changes the way viewers read him. When RM speaks thoughtfully, his nose reinforces that seriousness. When he laughs freely, it softens just enough to remind you he's human. This balance between firmness and warmth is why his visuals feel trustworthy. In Korean aesthetics, a nose like RM's often symbolizes leadership, intelligence, and masculinity, and his face embodies all three without leaning into excess. Over the years, as RM matured and stepped more confidently into his role as BTS's spokesperson and creative leader, the neatness of his nose became more apparent. Not because it changed, but because his entire presence grew into it. In candid moments, especially during book talks, museum visits, or reflective documentary scenes, his nose feels less like a physical feature and more like part of his storytelling. It frames his expressions, supports his seriousness, and grounds his emotional weight. Number 4 represents stability, a neat nose that doesn't chase trends or softness, but instead anchors identity. RM's nose doesn't distract, it clarifies. And in a group where visual impact often comes from intensity or beauty, his comes from meaning. That's why this placement feels earned, solid, and impossible to ignore the longer you watch. Number 3, Jimin, soft precision that feels almost unreal. Jimin's nose takes number 3 because it exists in a rare space where softness and precision coexist without canceling each other out. At first glance, it looks gentle, almost delicate, but the longer you look, the more you realize how incredibly controlled and intentional its structure is. The bridge is smooth and straight, never harsh, never overpowering, while the tip is refined in a way that blends seamlessly into his facial expressions. This is the kind of neat nose that doesn't dominate the face but perfects it, like a final brushstroke on a painting you didn't realize was missing anything. What makes Jimin's nose stand out is how emotionally responsive it is. When he performs, especially in contemporary or expressive choreography, his nose seems to move with his emotions, softening when he's vulnerable, sharpening slightly when intensity rises. In close-up performance cams, where every micro-expression matters, his nose enhances the fluidity of his face instead of interrupting it. Culturally, Jimin's nose fits beautifully into the Korean ideal of elegance, clean lines, gentle presence, and visual harmony. But what elevates it to this rank is consistency. From debut days to now, his nose has remained remarkably stable, even as the rest of his face matured, which gives his visuals a timeless quality. Fans often talk about how Jimin looks ethereal, and his nose plays a quiet but crucial role in that perception. It doesn't ground him too heavily in masculinity or softness, allowing him to float between both. Emotionally, it supports his dual image. On stage, it adds sharpness that cuts through choreography. Off stage, it melts into warmth that feels intimate and sincere. Number 3 represents refined balance, a neat nose that doesn't scream perfection but whispers it so convincingly that you don't question it. Jimin's nose doesn't ask for attention, yet once noticed, it becomes impossible to forget, lingering in the viewer's mind like a melody that refuses to fade. Number 2, Clean energy with relentless precision. Jhope takes number 2 because his nose carries something incredibly rare: sharp neatness powered by motion. Unlike features that only shine in still photos, Jhope's nose becomes more impressive the more he moves, the more he performs, the more energy he releases. Structurally, it's clean and straight with a well-defined bridge that holds its line no matter the angle, but never looks stiff or artificial. The tip is controlled, the proportions are tight, and the symmetry stays intact even under extreme expressions. Wide smiles, explosive laughter, intense stage focus. That's not easy, and that's exactly why it stands out. What makes Jhope's nose exceptional is how well it survives chaos. During high-energy performances, when sweat, movement, and harsh lighting could easily distort facial harmony, his nose stays crisp, anchoring his face like a visual stabilizer. It enhances his sharp jawline and expressive eyes, creating a look that feels powerful yet playful. In Korean visual terms, this is a textbook neat nose, but with personality injected into it. Emotionally, his nose amplifies his duality. When he smiles, it sharpens the joy. When he's serious, it adds edge. When he's focused, it radiates professionalism. Over time, as Jhope grew into his role as a performance leader and solo artist, the clean precision of his nose began to feel symbolic. It reflects discipline, consistency, and control beneath all that brightness. In candid moments, especially in documentaries, his nose gives him an unexpectedly refined look that contrasts beautifully with his chaotic energy, making him feel multidimensional rather than one note. Number 2 represents efficiency at its peak, a neat nose that doesn't just look good, but performs. It moves, it holds, it supports, and it never collapses under pressure. And that's why it lands just one step away from the top. Because as strong as it is, there's one member whose nose doesn't just complement the face, it defines it. And what truly locks Jhope into this number 2 position is how deceptively disciplined his nose feels when everything else about him is explosive. Watch him closely in performance-focused content, especially dance practice videos or raw rehearsal footage with zero filters, and you'll notice something strange. While his body releases chaos and rhythm, his facial structure stays clean and controlled. His nose becomes the visual spine of his face, holding everything together while expressions stretch to their limits. It doesn't warp, it doesn't lose balance, it doesn't distract. It sharpens the experience. That's why close-up cams of Jhope are so addictive. Your eyes keep returning to the center of his face without you realizing why. From a visual harmony standpoint, his nose has one of the most stable proportions in BTS. Whether he's tilting his head back mid-laugh, leaning forward in intense focus, or caught off guard in candid moments, the line of his nose remains consistent, which gives his visuals a polished, almost professional-grade finish. Emotionally, this consistency sends a message of reliability. Even when he's being playful, silly, or chaotic, there's an underlying sense of control, and his nose subtly reinforces that. Fans often describe Jhope as someone who radiates clean energy, and that's not just about personality, it's visual. His neat nose contributes to the feeling that everything about him is intentional, practiced, and sharp without being cold. Over the years, as his confidence grew and his solo identity became more defined, his facial features, including his nose, started to feel more commanding, not because they changed, but because he learned how to own them. In fashion shoots, especially minimalist or high-contrast concepts, his nose becomes strikingly noticeable, slicing through the frame with clarity and confidence. That's why number 2 feels so justified. Jhope's nose doesn't steal attention emotionally like some others, but technically, structurally, and performatively, it's one of the strongest in the group. It's the kind of neatness that professionals admire, cameras love, and viewers subconsciously trust. And yet, despite all that precision, there remains one member whose nose carries not just neatness and control, but legacy-level impact. Number 1. Silent sharpness that redefines neatness. Suga takes the top spot not because his nose is the loudest, the flashiest, or the most immediately eye-catching, but because it is the most intentional, the most controlled, and the most quietly powerful in the entire group. His nose embodies a kind of neatness that doesn't beg for validation. It exists with calm confidence, sharp but never aggressive, clean without feeling sterile. Structurally, Suga's nose is almost architectural, a straight, refined bridge, a compact yet defined tip, and proportions that sit perfectly within his face as if measured, paused, and approved by time itself. From the side profile, his nose delivers a crisp line that instantly elevates his visuals into something mature, composed, and undeniably cool. But what truly secures his #1 position is how his nose reinforces his identity. When Suga is quiet, introspective, or emotionally distant, his nose sharpens that intensity, giving his face an edge that feels intellectual and untouchable. When he smiles, rare, soft, genuine, it melts just enough to remind you there's warmth beneath the calm. This contrast is devastatingly effective. In high-definition close-ups, especially during interviews, documentary moments, or stripped-down performances, his nose becomes the emotional center of his face. It grounds his expressions, balances his eyes, and gives his entire visual presence a sense of seriousness that feels earned, not styled. Culturally, Suga's nose fits the Korean definition of neat at its highest level. Clean lines, natural proportion, no excess, no distraction. It doesn't overpower his face, but it defines it. Over the years, as his artistry deepened and his public image shifted from fierce rapper to reflective producer and storyteller, the neatness of his nose began to feel symbolic. It mirrors his precision in music, his clarity in thought, and his refusal to waste space emotionally or visually. In fashion shoots, especially minimalist concepts, his nose becomes striking without effort, cutting through silence like a single piano note in an empty room. #1 represents mastery, a nose that doesn't chase trends, doesn't rely on angles, and doesn't need movement to shine. Suga's nose holds its power in stillness, in restraint, in quiet authority. And that's why it ranks above the rest. Not because it demands attention, but because once you notice it, you realize it's been controlling the entire visual narrative all along. And what truly elevates Suga's nose beyond just neat into something almost iconic is how effortlessly it survives stillness. In a group known for explosive performance and high-energy visuals, Suga often wins by doing less, and his nose reflects that philosophy perfectly. When he sits still in an interview, hoodie pulled low, eyes calm but sharp, the clean line of his nose becomes the axis of his presence. It doesn't rely on expression to make an impact. It creates gravity on its own. Cameras linger on it not because it's dramatic, but because it feels intentional, like a signature that doesn't need explanation. From a visual storytelling perspective, his nose does something rare. It amplifies silence. In moments where he pauses before speaking, when his gaze drops or drifts sideways, the neat structure of his nose frames those micro moments with restraint and depth, making the silence feel heavy rather than empty. That's why his close-ups often feel more emotional than louder visuals. His face, anchored by that sharp, composed nose, tells a story without movement. Even under harsh lighting or minimal styling, his nose never loses clarity. It holds its line, keeps its balance, and reinforces the feeling that nothing about him is accidental. Over the years, as Suga became more comfortable showing vulnerability, talking about burnout, pressure, fear, the contrast between that emotional honesty and his visually composed features became even more powerful. His neat nose stands like a wall of control around a very human interior, and that tension is magnetic. It's also why fans often describe his visuals as timeless rather than trendy. His nose doesn't belong to a specific era or concept. It belongs to him. #1 isn't about perfection measured in millimeters. It's about impact measured in seconds of silence, in lingering shots, in the feeling that something is complete without excess. Suga's nose doesn't compete. It concludes the ranking.